is we're going to finish up last week's lesson, which is basically further developments of Protestantism, Lutheranism, if you will. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to look at Scandinavia, so Norway, Sweden, Denmark area, and we're also going to look at the developments in the Low Countries, or what we today call Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And then we're going to look at what goes on in France. So we're covering a lot of stuff and a lot of material. And a lot of this is in your notes, so I'm going to try to hit the highlights, let you fill in some of the background, but get to the key points of what's going on. As we have seen during this entire adventure, if you will, politics, religion, life, economics, dynastic struggle, you name it, is always active. It's not, there's no pure, okay, this is just the political situation, this is just the economic situation, this is just the religious situation. Life is always intermixed. And as we've also seen, a lot of the Reformation events, ideas, things that are going on with them are situations that create people on one side or the other of a religious issue when it really isn't a religious issue. It just happens to be, I will take advantage of the religious situation. Today we're actually going to see a guy swap back and forth depending on the political situation of what his quote-unquote beliefs are. And so it's kind of interesting. Politicians and religions don't typically go well together. So let's go ahead and start looking again at this Scandinavian Lutheranism. Now, in Germany, we've seen that a lot of the princes wanted, and a lot of the rulers wanted things to be kind of status quo. They did not want things to change a lot. So Lutheranism took a lot longer to be engaged with and get things going. Well, that's not so in the Scandinavian regions. And when I say Scandinavia, you have to realize that Denmark, in this particular situation, is considered part of Scandinavia just because of who ruled what and what people were where, even though we think of Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, even though Finland actually is a completely different group of people, so the Finns are totally different too. So in this case, we're going to talk about Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And they actually end up adopting Lutheranism a lot sooner, a lot stronger. And they, in the beginning of the 16th century, okay, this is early 1500s, had a thing called the Kalmar Union. And this included Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And they had a common leader. Now, it was kind of a loose confederation. It wasn't a really strong ruler because Norway continued to have its own governmental system, its own currency. Sweden was kind of under it but didn't like it too much. And Denmark was kind of the center of the power, if you will, and yet they really weren't in control, if that makes sense. You can have power but not be in control. And during this time, a freely elected viceroy, a guy named Sten Sture the Younger, wanted independence for Sweden from the Union. This does not go over well with the ruler of Denmark at the time and ruler of this area, Christian II. Now, I'm going to be saying Christian because there's Christian II and there's Christian III. And we're going to see Christian II and Christian III. This is Christian II. This is the first guy. And he is a guy who is related to the good old Habsburgs. And here's how it is. Christian is married to Isabella of Burgundy. We talked about the Burgundians and Burgundy and the color and wine and all that kind of stuff. The granddaughter of Maximilian I, who's the father of, I believe, in Austria? No. Yeah, I think he's an Austrian guy. That or Spain. He's the Habsburg. So Charles V is Charles I of Spain, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. So you got Charles mixed in here because of the marriage to Christian II. Okay, so if you already notice here, we have a mess with who's married to whom and who's uncles and nieces and all. And remember, we already had the problem with Charles and, Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. And so all these dynastic people are all intertwined. And they're each going on different sides, and each switching sides, and each changing sides constantly. Some of them are good rulers, some of them are bad rulers, some of them are whatever rulers. But politics have been engaged just because of the marriage relationship here. So Christian II is associated with the Catholic Habsburgs. All right? It gets even more convoluted, but don't worry. We'll see how that all works. So he tries to put down this uprising by Sten, and he wins. He beats Sten's army. He takes over. He goes in and he marches on Stockholm, and this is in 1520. Okay, 1520. Remember, 1517 was where we have the 95 Theses. So we already have fights and battles going on that are going to now start affecting who has what. So Lutheranism is just on the scenes at this time. But we've already seen peasant revolts and knights' rebellions and all that kind of stuff going in this time period. So again, all these events we've been talking about that look like they're separated by weeks and weeks and weeks in their class are actually all happening all at the same time. So you can imagine if you have the Knights' Rebellion going on in this war with these guys, how intertwined all this stuff gets. Again, I'm not going to try to unintertwine it for you. But he goes in there and he's proclaimed king over Sweden because he agrees to say, okay, all's forgiven, we'll just keep on pressing on. So after he was crowned, 3 days after he is crowned, he says, just kidding. I'm now king, you've crowned me as king. I'm going to go kill all you guys who revolted against me. So he kills 82 people in one day, some of the nobles. Again, remember we're talking Sweden, we're not talking about billions of people here. And these are the major leading nobles and people, and he kills them. Matter of fact, he digs up the guy who he beat, his body, who died in this battle, digs it up and burns it. So he was noted as Christian the Tyrant. So that's Christian the Second, Christian the Tyrant. We haven't got to Christian the Third yet. So this is not going over well with the people in Sweden particularly. The thing that's interesting about Christian, though, is he studied the humanists. He studied Erasmus and with Erasmus and a lot of the humanists. So he has all these progressive ideas about governing. Okay? After, of course, he murders people that get in his way. Machiavelli would have been very happy. Philip II, Machiavelli would be happy with. Charles V, Machiavelli would be happy with. But these guys are all trying to help with reforms with the guilds and other stuff. So a lot of the people like him even though he killed these folks. Are you getting the mess of thought right now? This guy's good because of that reason. He's bad because of this reason. He's good because of another reason. We've seen this as the behavioral pattern during this time period. And so this is what happens with Christian. He thinks he's an absolute monarch, but he isn't really. And unfortunately, his nobles start abandoning him because they don't particularly care for what he's doing. And so he continues with a civil war with the folks in Sweden. He's not particularly on good terms with the folks in the Netherlands either, which is his nearest neighbor. So in 1523, 3 years later, Christian is offered the crown, is exiled. So Denmark exiles him. And his crown is offered to Duke Frederick of Holstein. All right, so that's his uncle. Christian escapes from the Netherlands, awaits for aid from Charles V, and finally tries to take Denmark back in 1531. He loses, and he's in house arrest for the next 27 years. So, remember we've seen already with Mary and Elizabeth and all, they tried to treat people who were kings and royalty with, okay, you're still being treated nice, you're not tossed in prison, you're in house arrest. It's interesting, they really did treat royalty and nobility, for the most part, with some grace. They're still under house arrest, but why do you think they did that? Just politically, pragmatically. Why did they do that?
Because they're royals?
Yeah?
They're royals.
Yeah, they're royals. It could happen to them. So, if everybody turns on everybody, then we all are in trouble. because they all knew that they could rise to power and fall power, so it's much easier to be gracious to people and everybody sort of have we're all royal, we're all blue bloods, if you will. We'll all treat each other nice even if one takes over from the other. Because otherwise you die. So that tended to be sort of the rules of the game at that particular time in history. So 27 years of house arrest. Okay. That, of course, leaves somebody floating around out there that could be, if somebody else gets overthrown, to come back to try to get them in power again, right? That's the danger of leaving your enemies still alive, especially if they're royals. Now, what we end up with is Frederick is a little smarter than Christian II, and he says, look, it's much, much better for us to be a ruler in fact over a smaller kingdom like Denmark than a ruler in name over one with Norway and Sweden and Denmark. So he is proclaimed the ruler of Denmark, and he is also given authority over the Catholic Church as the ruler, because remember, the church and state were intertwined here. As far as it goes to Norway, he is a guy who says, look, you guys can be free, and Norway goes, you're okay as long as you do stuff decently. We'll proclaim you our king, but kind of don't mess with us. So they do, because they, again, had their government and their currency already. So it was kind of like, yeah, that's a good king. He's okay. Let's join. Sweden, however, was not particularly interested in that, and so he grants them their freedom. And this is what he's going to do. The thing that you're going to see, though, is in Denmark, because Frederick is becoming more and more Lutheran, because again, this is that 23, 27, 30, he's becoming more and more Lutheran, he starts changing the rules with the Lutherans and the Catholics in Denmark. What he ends up doing, though, is he says, okay, first off, Lutherans and Catholics have to share the same churches. I'm sure the Pope really enjoyed that one, right? He encourages the publication of the first Danish language Bible. Okay, so now he's publishing a Bible. He had a popular Lutheran preacher guy named Han Townsend. People were really to try to arrest him and try him for heresy, and so he appoints him his personal chaplain. So guess what? He has immunity. So he doesn't have to fight. He says, okay, you're my personal chaplain. It's like your personal pastor. Okay. That's the way you'd say. I'm your spiritual advisor for just you, or just you and your family. A lot of like sports teams will have chaplains. Basketball team has a chaplain. They're the ones that help people with. So this was rulers with their own chaplain. Okay. And in 1527, 10 years from the 95 Theses, Frederick authorizes the closure of Franciscan houses and monasteries in 28 Danish cities. Now, how well do you think that one's going to go over? Not particularly. So in some cases, he offers a little bit of money to the monks, but pretty much says, sorry, you're done, and he disperses the lands into his supporters. So the Lutherans, he supports them, but he supports them because that weakens the Catholic bishops. As we've seen, the Catholic bishops have become basically lords, governing officials. So again, their church-state relationship has been linked. So he says, well, if I support the Lutherans, that weakens the Catholics. Okay, is he a Lutheran? Is he a Protestant? Is he a Catholic? Is he just a politician? Kind of tough to tell sometimes. But he is, let's just say, empathetic with Lutheranism at this particular moment. He does this, of course, with enough skill so he doesn't create a war. There are some people who do the same thing and create a war between the Catholics and Protestants. He doesn't do that. And in 1533, now 6 years later, he dies, and people are like, okay, what's going to happen? His son, Christian III, not Christian II, so this is again Frederick's son who becomes Christian III, not Christian II, who's the Danish guy. The other one's his uncle, so they are related. But it's Christian III here. he gets elected, but since Christian II is still alive, some people want to support him because he has some progressive policies towards the peasants and other people. So, of course, what do you end up with? A mess, yeah. A civil war, yeah. So there's a fight back and forth between who's going on, and Christian III beats Christian II. All right? You need a scorecard to keep up with this stuff. And these are just the little things that are floating on the top. So he ends up, unfortunately, the nobility who supports him and the peasants who support Christian II, they don't get along so well. So what do you think is going to happen when the nobility who wins with Christian III and they have their peasants who supported Christian II? How well do you think it's going to go for the peasants? Not so well. Remember the peasants' revolt earlier? Well, you get the same kind of effect. Not quite the slaughter, but they're pretty harsh on them. So we end up with more fighting. But by 1536, Christian III, who is a staunch Lutheran, okay, so he is a staunch Lutheran, comes into power because he had attended the Diet of Worms. Remember we talked about that? He was there as a younger man and listened to Luther's arguments and said, I agree. So now he is convinced of Lutheranism. The previous guy was kind of supportive of Lutheranism, but he said, no, I agree with it. Of course, with rulers, that really doesn't make much difference. We'll see that in France here. And of course, some of his rulers, his nobles, don't like this. Christian was supported by mercenary armies from Germany because Frederick of Holstein had land holdings in Germany. He uses his victory to take some of the property from some of these other revolting guys to pay off his debt to Germany. So again, you've got money borrowing and land supporting and all going back and forth, and I'm sure people aren't real crazy about it. But he establishes the Lutheran Church of Denmark in 1536. He adopts the Lutheran ordinances, church organization, liturgy, and religious practices. He closed down some of those monasteries, convents, and hands those lands and power and money over to those who had helped him. Okay, that's Denmark. Then we get to Sweden. Okay? Don't worry. We will get more convoluted. In Sweden, we have this gentleman named Gustav Eriksson, who is basically going to be the guy who dominates Swedish history during this time period. Now, if you want to study military history, Gustav Eriksson, or Gustav Vasa, as he's eventually known, is probably one of the preeminent military leaders of the particular time period, too. So he not only, besides he's a ruler, he's also a great general. Unfortunately, there's some of these other guys who aren't quite so good generals, but he is. And after his father was killed during that uprising under Sten. Okay? He escaped. This is the son, escaped. And his father was Erik Johansson. Now, listen to the names. His father was Erik Johansson. He is Gustav Eriksson. Now, how does that work? Because we have... Yeah, see, we have Erik Johansson. Erik is the son of John, or Johann. Okay. And Gustav is Erik's son. So you have Erik Johansson and Gustav Eriksson. So if you wonder how you trace lineages, sometimes it gets really confusing. They didn't have the family name. They were Erik's son and Gustav's son, or Johansson's. Okay, kind of interesting. So the father and the son don't have the same name, last name as we would think. So your dad was Will? Yeah, my dad was Will, yeah. Although we come from a long line of Wills. Okay. So I guess my kids should be Richard's son, right? But he takes over, and he leads another civil war against Denmark. Now, we just moved back in time to 1521. Okay? 1520, we move back to time 1521. And he's successful in 1523. He's elected King Gustav I, or later Gustav Vasa. So see, you have Frederick, who realizes that he's not going to be able to support this stuff. you've got Gustav who fights him, and eventually he wins, and then he kind of goes, we're not going to fight all this stuff. And once he's in power, he sends away the archbishop, and because he doesn't like him, because he thinks he's an ally of Denmark. Okay, so now you have the Catholic archbishop of Sweden who is sent away because the new king of Sweden thinks that he's an ally of Denmark who he just went away from. And so, what does he do? He calls the Pope and says, hey, send me a new archbishop. And you think the Pope's going to take that kindly? No. And so he basically says, yeah, I don't think so. I think you're wrong. So, what do you think good old Gustav does? He says, all right, Pope, if you don't support me, if you won't do anything, I'll pick my own archbishop. Okay, we don't have the Church of Sweden yet. We don't even have the Church of England yet. Okay, so Sweden is breaking way, way, way earlier here. And he says, all right, I'm going to pick my own guy. And guess who he is? He's a Lutheran. So this guy picks a Lutheran to be the archbishop of the church in Sweden. How well you think that one goes over with the Pope? No. Not. See all the fun and games? Just pick this guy. So basically, Sweden breaks way earlier than anybody else, just through this little stuff. So their Reformation starts way earlier than even the stuff really in Germany or England or any place else. Kind of an interesting little dynamic here. And so he puts this Laurentius Petri, and he and his brother slowly take the Catholic Church and the doctrine and slowly introduce new Lutheran doctrine into the Swedish Catholic Church, which then becomes a Lutheran church, sort of. They don't have the scholarship that they had in Germany or in Geneva, or in other places, but they do create a Swedish Bible known as the Gustav Vasa Bible, and it is not a translation from the original Hebrew and Greek. It is a translation from Luther's German. So they could translate from German, but they couldn't translate from Greek and Hebrew. They didn't have that educational system in that place at that time. But they broke way earlier. And we will leave the rest of Gustav's reign and world domination and all the other kind of stuff to military history and other stuff. But this is how you end up with Swedish Lutheranism. Or Swedish Catholicism, Lutheranism. I mean, it's really kind of crazy how this all flowed out. So if you notice how all these guys intertwine and however all this stuff comes about, has anybody said, hey, look, they got together, they had a church council, they decided on doctrine and said, hey, we believe this? It didn't happen that way. Question?
So the Lutheran Church had archbishops also?
No.
Okay.
He was appointed archbishop of the Catholic Church in Sweden, but he was a Lutheran.
Okay, I gotcha. Okay.
Because remember, Luther wasn't trying to create a Protestant denomination. He was trying to reform the Catholic Church. And so this guy says, well, fine, Luther wants to reform the Catholic Church. I'll appoint this Lutheran guy as a Catholic archbishop, and then he'll slowly reform the Catholic Lutheran Church of Sweden. Yes. Have you figured out God works in ways that you're like, huh? So don't despair when things change and things go different. He's using it. Now, let's switch our attention now to the lowlands and to France. Just so you know, you don't want to be in the lowlands and you do not want to be in France during this time period in history. It is not a pleasant time at all for anybody.
Was it pleasant before this time?
Well, at least they weren't all killing each other constantly and having 40 and 50 and 60 years worth of war. We have one point in time where from the time I was in high school to now, that's how long they were at war. Okay? Not a pleasant thing. And then it doesn't even, really end there. It continues on with more fighting. So, the catharsis or the cataclysm or the clashes or whatever in the lowlands and in France are very, very bloody. Now, we've talked about way back when Luther started off. Remember we talked about there were some persecutions and people being burned and killed and all that kind of stuff elsewhere outside of Germany? Well, guess where it was? It was in the Netherlands, in Belgium, Luxembourg, what we call. They at that particular time were the 17 counties, I think it was. They weren't actually a nation or nations as we recognize them today. They were kind of regions, and they were kind of unified, and they kind of worked okay together, sort of, but they spoke 3 different languages. Because you have French, Belgian, and Flemish. French, Dutch, and Flemish, sorry. I can't even keep my languages correct.
What's that last language? What is that?
Flemish is now in Luxembourg. It's kind of a German-French kind of hybridish kind of thing. Which, oh, by the way, was Charles V's actual most comfortable tongue, not Spanish or French or German or anything else. He was actually more comfortable in Flemish. So, we end up that this is where some of these people were, but the Habsburgs, remember? The Habsburgs, who were in Austria, Germany, Spain, Italy, Luxembourg. Let's see, what does that do to France? France is surrounded. England's over here. So these guys are in power. So do you think the French are going to be the allies of anybody?
No.
Only people who are in rebellion to the Habsburgs with the French help. We'll see that in a second. Because they're not real crazy about the Habsburgs' power. Early on, Charles, lived there. He was a guy who was actually well-liked. He was very comfortable there. He kind of grew up there. People considered him a native. Charles V, Holy Roman Empire, Charles I of Spain, actually lived and grew up in the Netherlands. Actually, Luxembourg, because Flemish was the language he liked the best. Got that all? So he's the 5th and the 1st, but he grew up not in either place. And he was well-liked there. And he was staunchly Catholic. Remember, he's the guy who's going after Luther. All right? That sets the stage. His son is Philip II. So when Charles takes over in Spain and is the Holy Roman Emperor, he moves back to Spain, sets his son, Philip II, who, by the way, did not grow up there or feel comfortable there, particularly, over that region. All right? So now you have the father with moves who puts the son back there, who's not comfortable there, and the people aren't the craziest about him, but they're not going to fight him too much to start with, until he makes them resources. I am the ruler, and you are going to be ruled. I don't really care about you. You are merely resources that I will use. Cannon fodder, take economic, whatever it happens to be, that's what I'm going to do. People don't like that. Before, they got along with Charles just fine. Matter of fact, many of them were very Catholic. Even under Charles, he killed thousands of people who were Protestants. All right? But they still liked him because he got along with them okay. And many of them were like, oh, they are heretics early on. But slowly but surely what happens is Lutheranism gets in there. Then the Anabaptists, which we talked about, get in there. Then ultimately, who do you think ends up being the dominant Protestant group in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg region? Who do you think? Calvin. Yeah, Calvinists. Because Calvin set up the Genevan Academy and set up and started training people. And what happens? You get trained, they go back out to their countries, because remember, they're fleeing and running, and John Knox and all those people from England, all this stuff. They go to Geneva, they get trained, and who do they come out as? Calvinists, not Lutherans or Anabaptists. So Calvinism, actually, which gets spread there. And that's eventually where you get the Council of Dort, and you end up with the Remonstrance and Calvinism, Arminianism, and all that kind of stuff. That's actually in this particular region. So they become very strongly Calvinistic over time. Over time. I don't want to go into too much more of the politics here. But there was also movements earlier, and we mentioned this I hope I mentioned this in earlier classes, a movement called the Brethren of Common Life. And this was very much of a, let's get back to reading the Scriptures, meditating the Scriptures, get them in their native language. Let's start talking about the Scriptures again. Very humanistic, not humanistic as we do today, but humanities, going back to learning, and investigative. Okay? In other words, let's stop just looking at the traditions. Let's look and see what the Bible actually says. Let's read. Let's have devotions. Let's have personal development. So the Brethren of Common Life, again, those are some of the forerunners of the Protestant Reformation. They're there in that particular area, influencing things. Charles, again, we know doesn't like any of this stuff. He killed tens of thousands. The leaders were punished, buried, burned, women buried alive. He's still popular.
With who?
Most of the people. Not the people that are dying, but most of the people. Philip takes over, and of course, as he isn't quite so smart, even in that brutality, as his father, he then appoints his half-sister Margaret to rule the region. And what does Margaret do? She says, hey, let's bring some Spanish troops in here. Because we need to make sure people know who's in charge. Now, how well do you think this goes over with people who are supposedly loyal subjects of Charles and Philip? Yeah, it's kind of like, let's see, putting British garrisons in the middle of Boston. Did people react well to that? No. She did the same thing. See, George III should have learned from Margaret. Don't do that. And so they basically looked at it and said, look, you've got a ruler who doesn't care about us. You're ignoring our people. Now you're bringing foreign troops in. You don't even trust us. Why don't you have our troops support you and protect you? You're bringing Spanish troops in here? I don't think so. So what do you think is going to happen? Everybody's studying their doctrine well, looking at their Bible. No, you're going to end up with a rebellion that starts being fomented. And this is what's going to end up happening. And a lot of the people who are loyal turn to this gentleman named William of Orange, or William the Silent, he's often called, and a gentleman also called Count Egmont. And they were loyal servants of the king, and they were essentially moderate Catholics. In other words, okay, yeah, I don't like this stuff, but let's all get along. That was their kind of approach. Over time, unfortunately, as this progressed, William and some of the other people get alienated, and eventually they have a series of conflicts, and they send Egmont to Philip of Spain. Okay, now Philip's in charge. This is a little bit later. Again, 1555 is when Philip takes over. He says, hey, I'm going to have more reasonable policies. I'm going to do all this stuff. So Egmont comes trundling back. He opens the letter after all of his verbal promises, and guess what's in the letter? All the agreements he came to, right? No. Every single thing he told Egmont was a lie. And the letter basically says, enforce all the policies of the Council of Trent, which we're going to talk about, I think, next week. The Council of Trent, which is the Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation, depending on how you want to call it. And you know how that one came out, anathema on anybody who believes this, anathema on anybody who believes this, anathema on anybody who believes this. He said, pretty much enforce the policies. Oh, by the way, if they're heretics, you can kill them. Yeah. So Egmont went to Philip, got to his face, and the letter told everybody, kill them all, pretty much. How well do you think that goes over? Not so well. So, Margaret wants to enforce these decrees, and puts to death anybody who opposes. And the local nobles say, please don't do that. And his advice, and oh, you'll love this one from a historical perspective. Her advisors told her not to listen to those beggars. Does this sound familiar? Yeah, we have a recent rephrasing of that. And this becomes the symbol of a rebellion for the next 40 years. The beggars.
I hope that's not prophetic.
I'm merely just teaching the lessons as they're falling. 40 years because of this event, or a series of events that leads up. They are at basic civil war or fighting with the Habsburgs and all for a long time, into the early 1600s. And so let's turn ourselves to the beggar rebellion, and we end up with the beggars of the sea and other stuff, all sorts of fun stuff. So, because her policy following Philip's direction was to kill anybody who disagreed, they had armed protective beggars at the Council of State who were protecting people preaching. So, you want to kill us? You got to get through us first. Remember, forget Constitution and all that stuff, guys. This is not America. This is not the way things were operated then. So there were people who literally were standing armed, protecting people preaching, and anybody who was speaking against these policies. So they eventually say, hey, William of Orange, you're one of our leaders. You're one of the smart guys around here. Help us out. And he tries to calm things down because the people referred to as iconoclasts were smashing altars, destroying images in church. William knows his own life is at risk, and he tries to say, calm it down, people. Does this sound familiar to you? What he ends up doing, does anybody know what an iconoclast is? I'm sorry, I put big words in there. An iconoclast is somebody who, in the generic sense, is overturning cherished or sacred beliefs. Okay? An icon, yeah. You're overturning it. And there's a phrase that you'll hear in other times: iconoclast versus iconodual. Iconoclasts are those who are breaking images, and in particularly the secondary meaning that got applied to this in this particular time with those who were going in and destroying imagery and symbols and pictures and crucifixes and all in Catholic churches. They were called iconoclasts, both theologically and actually physically going in and destroying stuff. Iconoduals were the people that were referred to as anybody who were image worshipers. They were worshiping the past, they were worshiping the image. So you have iconoclasts and iconoduals. So you're an image worshiper, you're worshiping an image and you're violating, God's law, etc., 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 or you're worshiping these traditions. And the iconoclasts were saying, I'm breaking those traditions, I'm not paying any attention to them, and oh, by the way, I'm going to break all the symbology. Most of it was breaking symbology. Okay? And that they would strip churches down to bare walls. Even putting a cross up without Christ on it would be considered iconodual. So the little cross we have up front, they would want to rip that down. So, things are going peaceably now. We're all getting together and reasoning together. We're working out things. We're discussing doctrine. No, that's not what's happening. But William is trying to calm this stuff down. And he was successful in arranging some limited freedoms of worship. But that's not going to hold out too long because Philip did not wish to be lord over heretics. And so he promises to abide by the agreement while he's raising an army to stomp them out. And he operates under the principle that if they're not faithful, I don't have to be either. So you can lie to the heretics. Or in modern Islamic terms, it's okay to lie to the infidels. Same principle they used here. This is what Philip uses. So I don't have to tell you the truth. I can agree to whatever until I have the opportunity to raise the army to go crush you. And then break all my promises. Pretty Christian right now, right, guys? Want a Reformation? Yikes. So, William, of course, finds this out because how many secrets are kept There's only one type of secret that's kept. The one that's never shared. That's the only secret that's ever kept. So he finds out about it. And he returns to his German holdings. So he gets out of the Low Countries and he moves back to Germany. And his friends in Egmont, he says, hey, come back with me. And they said, oh, no, we're going to trust the king. Because he promised us, right? Ends up being a fatal mistake on their parts, just so you know, jumping ahead. So in 1567, Spanish and Italian troops under Duke Alba, who, by the way, is a tremendously good general. Not nice, but good general. Difference. He comes in and he sets up this thing called the Council of Disturbances, and later is referred to as the Council of Blood. He has no obligation to prove guilt or innocence, so he condemns many Protestants along with Catholics who didn't stand strong enough with him. You could be just a nice Catholic and say, well, okay, well, you're not standing strong enough, and kill them. I just feel you weren't supportive enough of me. You're dead. So how many people do you think like Alba? Philip does, but he's just alienating people. So he ends up arresting Egmont Horn along with William's 15-year-old son. William, of course, raises an army with his personal funds, goes to war, and though he's a nice guy, he's a horrible general. And he ends up losing. The only thing that he actually does well is help a small group of privateers attack William's supply line. So if you know anything about the military, the hardest thing to do is keep an army in the field. And what's the best way to keep the army out of the field? Is you cut off their supplies. Of course, that usually means then they go plundering, raping, and pillaging the locals because they get hungry. And he sets up this little privateer fleet, and they're referred to as the beggars of the sea. That's what they're labeled as. And good old Queen Elizabeth, remember we've talked about Elizabeth and Mary and all that stuff. Queen Elizabeth is on the throne in England at this particular time, and she provides some tacit support. They could sell their prizes and things like that in English ports and all this stuff. How well do you think this is going to go over with Philip of Spain, just off the top of your head? See, Catherine of Aragon shunned by Elizabeth, Guess what happens in 1588? We're jumping ahead, but what happens in 1588? Major world event in English history. And Spanish Armada, yeah. Philip II of Spain sends an invasion fleet of 130 ships referred to as the Spanish Armada in August 1588 to invade England. And guess what Elizabeth learns from the beggars of the sea? Little fast ships can disrupt the more powerful Spanish ships, and they learn from these events of how to attack the Spanish. By the way, they hardly did any damage. It was the storm in the North Sea, the act of God, that basically wiped out the Spanish Armada. But that invasion was stopped. But part of it was attacked by these English ships, because England did not have the powerful navy at this time. This was Spain's world dominance, not England's. This is where English ascendancy goes. And boy, if you're the most powerful naval power on the planet and these little beggars of the sea are giving you a hard time, that is not going to bode well for you. All right. So we end up with William trying to raise another army, and he gets help from the French. Unfortunately, as he's marching along, he hears of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which we're going to look at next, where the French Huguenots are destroyed or attacked or killed. And if you remember back when we talked about John Knox got out of his bed, gave one last sermon to press on after he heard about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This is the same time, 1572 time period. So he breaks away. 1573, though, he moves from modern Catholic to Calvinist. And so he becomes, says, I'm really tired of this stuff. I really do believe this doctrinal stuff. I'm actually a Calvinist now. So If you notice, from political to moderate to I'm tired of it to, you guys are really wrong, and actually I do believe this stuff. So there's a big journey here for William of Orange. He eventually is, there's a whole bunch more wars, let's just say. And they keep fighting, and they keep fighting, and they keep fighting. 1576, they all agree to the thing called the Pacification of Ghent. And of course, they focus on organization versus religion of these regions. This still doesn't go well because Philip sends a guy named John of Austria. By the way, Don Quixote, the Dons of California. Don is a word that's used in Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish, mostly, from the Latin word dominitus, I think it is. It basically means Lord, so, or they're the noble. So whenever you hear the word, it's Don something else, that's basically Lord so-and-so. In English, we would use that same Lord word, but they use the Latinization of Don or Dom sometimes. That's why you have the Italian Dons in the mafia families. The ruler, the Lord. That's where that all comes from. So they don't like him particularly. They continue to fight until 1580. Philip offers 25,000 crowns for anybody who killed William of Orange. 3 years later, William of Orange is killed. What do you think Philip does with that $25,000 reward? He reneges. He eventually gives the assassin a few bucks, but he lies because he doesn't care, and he's the king. So he. The good news in all that is William's son's far better general and now starts winning. So he takes over, and he fights. His son Maurice fights, and in 1607, if you notice, we just jumped ahead a little bit, Philip dies. Spain tries to continue the end to the war in a truce, basically a decade later. So north is firmly Calvinistic in those areas. The south is still Catholic, and those become Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg.